For those who are listening online, there's two things I want to start with tonight. One is we do have additional copies that were printed off of the Gospel Train. This is one of the original ones, but they're in the office, and if you're listening and in the next few years you'd like to have one, we'll get in touch with the office and we'll try to get one to you. A second thing is that online, the train has been put online, and I thought I would just read this slowly for those, again, who are listening in. And the location is garden, like a rose garden, but it's just gardenofpraise.com. And then there's a slash, and the term harmony, 00.htm. So on the website Garden of Praise, then this has been put online, and it's available there. And if you want to track things down, and as Kyle found out, each of the sections on the train, when you start going through it, are a separate PDF. And if you're at home and you want to print those off, you can do that, or we'll try to get one to you if you'd like to have one. Glad you're here. Always good to get together, just to study and be together. I'm not looking for anything specifically, and I will repeat it for the people here. What are your observations at this point? Either what do you feel like you have, and you fill in the blank. What do you feel like you've seen or understood? What are some things that are happening with you in terms of just looking at this and seeing?
To me, it's made, my reading, and I'm in the Gospels, because October 1 it started in the New Testament.
Right.
It's like the big picture finally comes all around it. It's fuller. It's a fuller story.
Yeah.
And rather than just reading it, I'm thinking of more than just the words. I'm thinking of what's going on around it.
Yes. And George's comment for people who are reading through narrated Bible this time of year, they're just starting into the Gospels. And again, I would use, from what you said, again, the word context. And I said this previously, but if I get a call for a Wednesday night series and you fill in the blank, would you do something from one of the Gospels? Then the first thing I do is find out where it is on my train, turn to the page, visually see, okay, this is what is going on. And so I may not use any of that necessarily in the lesson, but just for me, I have a better context, both in terms of kind of the season, the year of the ministry, and the other things. And that to me just helps a lot because, and this is not their fault, but as we've seen, the gospel accounts are not written to be just strictly in chronological order, especially Matthew's more thematic, and we'll come back to that tonight. So good, a broader context.
I'm noticing how many blocks of time in the life and ministry of Jesus we don't have.
Yes.
We have a big block here, and a big gap, and a nice block here, and then a big gap. That's amazing.
Yes. And that comment, and like I said, and I've done this for years, if I go to a lectureship and there's something on the synoptics or the Gospels, there's two things I'll nearly always go to. One is on raising children and creating faith in children, and the other is the Gospels. And the most, in all these years, the most that I've read, some guys said he felt like he had found close to 40 days, but most people will say about 30 or 31 days. And again, here's another context. Look at how that changes your perception of, quote, the life of Christ. And again, I'm not a picky particular person on this. That's why I don't use the term biography. And my favorite example is, okay, you're going to write a biography of Winston Churchill, and you get to pick a month of individual days in his life. There's going to be huge parts that are left out. And we're going to close with this tonight. Many other signs and wonders Jesus did. And so while that's going to be true of the signs and wonders, then it's also true, and even like this first year when he is well received, if it wasn't for John, there's a whole bunch of early things we wouldn't know about. And then there's these huge gaps. And how many of you have been to Quartz Mountain to the camp? Because I figured a lot of us have. We just called it Devotional Mountain there, that we would climb up when I was there. I started going at 9 and was a counselor as soon as I could be a counselor. This is kind of scary to me now, but at the wise old age of 22, the board asked if I would direct a week of camp. So I did 4 weeks of camp before we went to Australia. And so the camp was just so much like home and everything. But when you go up to the very top of Devotional Mountain, if you look straight north toward the metropolitan area of Lone Wolf, then what is between Devotional Mountain and Lone Wolf? Wheat. There's some wheat fields and some other stuff. And then if you look to the due east and head toward Roosevelt, then you have a whole different view, and you can see toward Lawton, and it's a whole different scene. And then if you look south, there's just that dip, and there's that taller mountain. And then my favorite, though, is then to look back to the west, and when the lake is down, and I'm way out of date because I haven't been there for a long time, but for a long time we could still see some of the original buildings of Lugert.
Yeah.
So the rock house is what I call it. When they decided we're going to build the dam, if I use the term barn raising, Amish people, you know what I'm saying? The community decided we are going to save the school building, and they set up a project to take it apart boards at a time and lay it out, and they were going to carry it over here to this intersection and rebuild that, and then the WPA bricked it, the rocks that are around it. And so if they hadn't done that, that building would be underwater in the lake. But here's my point. You come up to the top, and whichever direction that you look, you see a totally different view, and I haven't tried to climb all of them, but the climb up to the top is very different on each of the sides of the mountain. That's what I think of when I think of the Gospels, in that the ultimate objective of each of the Gospels is to get us to the cross. And I like this little expression. The Gospels are the story of the cross with a different introduction. And so in the same way that when you look a different direction, you get a totally different view. And I think a lot of that is the audience, because they're writing to totally different people. But, and how amazing is this, how many languages are in the world today, and how many languages have at least had part of the gospel written to them? And so in addition to the different perspectives in the first century, how different have people looked at the Gospels for the last 2,000 years? So we have big chunks that aren't there. What else? Oh, sorry, Greg. I'm an auctioneer's son. I'll say sold. You waved.
I should say it really just fills in the blanks and brings everything together, I think.
Yeah. And like I said, and this has been my practice since 71 and 72. Obviously, go away, do something else, but I always keep 2 or 3 of these in my office, and at different times something will come up, and I'll say, oh, now where's that on the train? And pull it down, and once you know how to work your way through it, then you can kind of find and locate some things.
It kind of ties it together.
Yes, and for those of us that are visual,
Yeah.
you know, if you've done this for an 8-year-old, 10-year-old little boy to start with, then for the rest of us, that helps us to kind of come back. And once you kind of see the framework, you know where the things are dated, then it helps us a lot. I just want to give an example, and we're going to spend more of our time tonight, pardon me, on the miracles and the nature of miracles, but we're going to do a couple of things before we do that. Who knows? I heard maybe 3 or 4 sermons growing up through the years. And again, I'm never openly just critical because I love different points of view. But have you heard the sermon where the guy says, you know, we're in Luke chapter 5 and Jesus walks by the sea and, throw your nets out on the other side, and then come follow me, and then just, for some reason, or miraculously, they just drop everything and follow this guy that they've just met for the first time, is at least the impression I got from the lesson. So I want us to turn to John chapter 1, and on our train, we obviously then are going to notice the events of the pre-existence, not that we're going to cover them in detail, but I'd like for you to open to the section that has the baptism, the temptation, and Cana and Capernaum. So just open to this particular section very, very early on the train. Okay? About second or third one's over. And then let's turn to John chapter 1. And here again, a word that I use a lot is the word selectivity. By doing this, this will help you to have a clearer sense of how selective each writer is. And we touched on this the very first night in passing, but let me go ahead and just do it again. And I might not be able to use this with your grandchildren, but when I think of a gospel account, I think of going to first cafeteria. Okay? What's the setup? And you can see your grandchildren look at me saying, cafeteria, what's a cafeteria? Well, at least the cafeterias I'm familiar with, you have like a salad section typically, right? Then you do a meat section, and then a vegetable section, and then desserts. Everybody okay? And so if you think of in terms of discourses, sermons, lessons, if you think of examples from his life, miracles, parables, then these are like the different events that are along and what do you call it? It's not the line where all the stuff is. And I think in the same way that you go through, being on the farm, we processed a lot of our own meat, and my mom made a really, really good version of liver and onions that I've never been able to convince my wife of how good that is. And if I use the term acquired taste, everybody is with me. And so the object when you go to a cafeteria is that you don't get a spoonful of everything. You have to choose certain things. And through the years, if she's been working or something and I've eaten out and had a really nice lunch and she says, "What did you have for lunch?" I says, "Oh, it was just liver and onions. You wouldn't have liked it anyway." And there'll be this pause and she'll say, "Okay, come clean. What did you really have?" I said, "What did you have?" "Well, I had peanut butter. I had liver and onions today," so that's how it is. But when you go through a cafeteria, depending upon taste and depending upon how honest you're going to be with your wife, decides on what you get on the other side, right? And if I went to Red Lobster, she does not like the clam chowder. And I used to get clam chowder, maybe shrimp. I just ate on the bottom of the aquarium. You wouldn't have liked it today. But anyway, we choose an item or two from each one of those, and those go on our tray for that particular meal and that particular time. Well, if you think of the gospel writers, and for example, our first and last are eyewitnesses. I think Mark gets and we're going to talk about this, Lord willing, in the spring. I think Mark gets a lot of his information from Peter. When Peter gets out of prison, and you think if you've been in prison in Acts chapter 12, where does Peter go as soon as he gets out of prison? To the home of John Mark's mother. And then when you have the writing of 1st and 2nd Peter, there are going to be references to Mark. And just this immediate and straight way, and just like Peter, Mark just kind of has this really quick flow. And then, as we said, Luke says, I went and I talked with the eyewitnesses and the ministers of the word. So these guys, 2 of them are eyewitnesses. Mark, and Sheila asked this week, she said, who do you think is the young man in Mark chapter 15 that they grabbed his clothes and he runs away in the dark with no clothes on. I said, well, speculation, but Mark's about as good a candidate. Who else would know that except an eyewitness? You know, Jonah, if someone had grabbed your clothes and you ran away without any clothes in the dark, would you want that put in the newspaper the next day? That type of thing would tend to be something that you would more keep to yourself. And, well, guess what happened to me last night? It'd be the type of thing that you wouldn't as likely reveal. And so each one of them has unique either sources or information that are a part of it. And I want us to start in and I'm in John 1, chapter 1 and verse 19. And if you just noticed time-wise, that's going to be in the engineer's cap, in the baptism and the temptation. And so here's John's testimony. And already there's this, and John does this from the very first chapter. As soon as there's any kind of conviction or faith, then opposition begins to build. And they're going to reach a climax with the crucifixion. And if you'll see all the way down to verse 24, Pharisees had been sent to question him. And if you look at verse 28, this all happened at Bethany on the other side of the Jordan where John was baptizing. Now, either in your what I want to do is to account for 7 days in John chapter 1. So you may just want to make a note in your book or something. I like to have this in my Bible, but let me walk you through this first, and then you can decide if you want to put this in your Bible or not. But here's a snapshot. Here's the day, the things with John the Baptist, and this happened at Bethany on the other side of Jordan where John was baptizing, and I have day 1. Okay? Then, when you come to 129, what does John say? Next day. So this is going to be day number 2. You see what I'm saying now? So when in 129 he says the next day, then we go back and we say, oh, well, the previous day was the things with John the Baptist. That's day 1. So here is day 2. And then when you look down in verse 35, what does John tell us? So what day is that going to be? That's going to be day 3, right? Everybody okay? And then when you come to verse 43, what do you have? So how many are we at? 4. And then when you come to chapter 2 and verse 1, what does John tell us? So someone help me. You see what I'm saying? In the first chapter, into the water changing to wine, to have 30-some days in the whole life of Jesus, we have a week in the life of Jesus in the early part of the ministry that we don't have any account for of the others. Now, everybody okay with what we just did? And see, it's one of those really subtle things, and when you get to looking at it, okay, in the beginning was the Word was with God. And Genesis 1 gives us what? The 7 days of creation. And so, type and shadow. In the beginning was the Word. All these things about the Word was with God. All things were made through Him. And then here is our Genesis 1. And in John 1, we have 7 days of creation in Genesis, and John's going to give us 7 days in the early ministry of Jesus as the Word begins to start. Now, the other thing that's really, really significant, if you look in 29, John's going to just use the term the Lamb of God. And then is the term the testimony. But then 138 is very significant. And while we may not know all the names yet, but when you come to 135 through 37, what do you find out? In addition to John the Baptist, what do we have? Okay, we're going to start having some of John's early disciples, and let me just go ahead and give the explanation. Long before Jesus comes along in Luke 5 and says, put your boat out into the water, cast your net on the other side, these guys have already met Jesus at the very beginning of the ministry, and because they are disciples of John the Baptist, one of the many ways in which John prepares the way, which is the word for road, John prepares the way of the Lord, is that John sends some of his closest disciples and says, Lamb of God. And so then if you notice, you have these two disciples, and where are you staying in 38? So we come to 40. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two. And the first thing Andrew did was to find his brother, Simon, and say, we have found the Messiah. And then his name will be Peter. And then when you come to 44, then you have Philip, Andrew, Peter, and Nathaniel. Now, and I'm not trying to be picky, but just to help you to see this, where are we at on the train in John 1, 44 and 45? Yeah, the fall, if we just use their dates, the fall of 26. Okay, but do you see what I'm beginning to say? Is that when then you have a better feel for the chronology of when things happen, then it makes a whole lot more sense to me later, because they've spent time with Jesus. John the Baptist has pointed him to them. Oh, this is the Lamb of God. They call him the King of Israel. So rather than Jesus walking by the Sea of Galilee, cast out your boat, throw your net on the other side, and then just voila, they just are so impressed. They've known him for a period of time. Now, I'll leave you to look for it. Find Luke 5, which I think is the cast your net to the other side. And let's see, where's Luke 5 on the train? You'll have to kind of look at some of the zip codes and some of the other stuff. Anybody find Luke 5 and 1 yet?
Second row on the
Pardon? Spring of 28. Yep. Now, do you see what I'm trying to say by way of chronology? They have known of him since the engineer's cab much earlier, so we may have up to a year and a half, and they have kind of been early disciples and other things. And like I said, I'm not being hypercritical of the lessons that I heard, but after I got to looking at something like, I didn't have any way to look at it. And it just, and I listened and I just said, yes, okay. But it does seem a little strange that you'll leave your wife and your family and your business and everything else for someone that has just walked by and said, hey, come follow me. That makes less sense than, oh, we've had a year and a half. We've heard him teach and preach. We've been a part of the early disciples. And this core is also, the nucleus is also going to be early disciples of John the Baptist. And John is fulfilling his role in pointing people to Jesus and identifying him. But look at how different you'll see the calling of the disciples with the net when then you see the period of time that's passed by. That makes a whole lot more sense why they would make a much more informed decision. George?
I just had this thought that, nowadays somebody that's this smart is trying to put it in children's, and basically, I've learned like a child. But I'm just thinking, we would probably try to take a spreadsheet and get all this out in a spreadsheet and build this, big fancy thing.
Yeah.
And they did it like this.
Yeah.
But they knew he was the Messiah too. Andrew, when he went and found Simon, he said, come, we found the Messiah. It's spoken of by the prophets. So they knew that he was the Messiah a year and a half ago.
And again, there's the work of John the Baptist. And let me just look at the other thing real quick, since you brought that up. look at, and I'm back to the big train. John is going to go to jail halfway between the engineer's cabin when they're called to come following. And so John has done his job, the voice crying in the wilderness, and he's taught people, people have been baptized, but there may not have been anything any more significant than these early band of brothers that are pointed to Jesus. Just something to tuck away. And I had a teacher that said this one is free, doesn't have anything specifically to do with this tonight. But a few years ago, anytime, and especially in my earlier life, that I could go listen to an older preacher, I wanted to listen, because I grew up with, until I was 21, I had 8 great and grandparents, and started doing funerals at 101, 100, 99, 98, 96, 93, and the young ones died at 89. And so being the oldest son and kind of the chaplain, and so we were blessed with just decades of oral history and life and stuff. So anytime I've been able to listen to an older preacher, now that I'm becoming one, it's harder to find the older preachers, but still, I'll go anytime that I can. But Howard Norton made this comment. He said, for the decades that I've been a Christian and have been in ministry, I have come to the conclusion that very few of us will know in this life what is the most significant thing we did for God. He said, because something that was very small to us at the time, in his own way, in his own time, God may use to do something that we could never have imagined. And he said, I'm just convinced that very few of us will actually know what is the most important thing that we did for God. Olivia, how old are you?
I'm 15.
Okay. This happened once and some of you heard me mention this happened once in Tennessee and once in Texas. And I've had, again, 2 older men that have talked about it. The one in Tennessee, this church had done a 2-week meeting. They had hired a preacher, they had hired a song leader and all this stuff. And the grumbling was only one skinny 12-year-old girl was baptized. And it was kind of like, okay, you know, we spent all this time and all this money, and, you know, we were hoping for multitudes or whatever else, and the report was, and you could just see the guy kind of going like this, only one, isn't that a compliment? Skinny, knock-kneed girl was baptized. A few decades go by and she gets married, and she has 5 sons, and all 5 of her sons become gospel preachers. So 50 years later, how different does that failure look like that we only had one skinny 12-year-old knock-kneed girl baptized? And that's why we're just, that little expression in Ecclesiastes, cast your bread on the water. We just serve God. We do everything that we can. We leave it to him, but we have no idea what God's going to do with things that to us at the time may not be that important. And then look at John the Baptist. Can I use the word recruit? John the Baptist recruits the core of the apostles. And yes, he's preparing the way of the Lord. He's doing that. But I'm confident at the time, he didn't have the perspective, yeah, that was really important. And then even in his own life, are you the one to come or shall we look for another? He dies nearly with a question mark. Has any of this been worthwhile? And yet look what God has done with and through the things that he did. And that's a very important thing for us to remember, because we never know what God's going to do. When we moved to Campbelltown, and like I said, I always think of Newcastle or Tuttle. And Sydney was about 3.5 million. Sheila met a lady named Faith. And Faith didn't have a lot of education, but Faith is one of those persons that she could get 12 different jobs in a year. She could just sell herself, and she just had this go, and all this stuff. Well, when Sheila first met Faith, Faith was doing a frozen chicken cooperative. And they're cheaper than you get in the store, but the more that we buy, the cheaper the chickens will be and all this stuff. And so, you know, Sheila wasn't knocking doors, and this wasn't a real spiritual. She just met her and got talked to. Oh, do you go to church? No, we don't go to church. We have 2 girls. Come to church with us. Well, Faith became a Christian, and her daughters started coming. Frank was like this, just stay away from. In fact, he started going to the Catholic Church after she was baptized because he didn't want to have anything to do with the Yankees. And I'm sorry. I was born south of the Mason-Dixon line, and I wanted to give a geography lesson so bad I couldn't stand it, but it wasn't appropriate. And we were just called Yankees all the time. And after maybe 3 years, Frank started coming. And the night Faith was baptized, my sister-in-law Nancy, who's just a ray of sunshine, hello, da-da-da-da-da, she asked Frank 5 questions. He said, yep, and wouldn't say a word. Anyway, in 87, we left at Christmas of 90. Frank was baptized. And sometime after we left, Faith became faithless and left him with 2 pre-teenage girls and left the church to go find herself. And so the blessing of getting to go back each year, I'd stay in touch with Frank, how you doing? And he worked for the gas company. The ride came at 5 o'clock. He'd get up at 4, have a quick breakfast. And he had quit doing his quiet time, his reading. But when I went back, he said, you know, that poor fellow Jeremiah went through all kinds of stuff, didn't he, to stay faithful for God. And I came back and told Sheila, I said, Frank's going to make it. He started reading a good book. He's over, in terms of just being paralyzed. Anyway, when Kent and Nancy left, Frank became the preacher in the church there in Campbelltown, and has just recently retired and has been the preacher there for nearly 30 years. And where did it start? A frozen chicken cooperative. Oh, do you go to church? And just that open door. And none of us know when that's going to happen. And here's to me this great example with John the Baptist. He did so much more than he understood, and we need to be encouraged because we won't always see what God is going to do with things that are faithful down the road. Brett?
I mean, if I'm John the Baptist, I'm sitting in jail wondering if this all right. I mean, I think I'd harken back to the baptism of Jesus, and all of a sudden God says, "This is my only begotten Son." Well, please, if you believe that was God, I think that would be something you'd say,
This study should be core to anybody that wants to personal evangelism, because you got to understand it's you got to get you out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't take things personal. It's just, you just, like you said, keep throwing the bread out of the water.
Mm-hmm.
Not taking it personally is a skill. It's developed over time.
Yes. Well, and and we've all had the experience of investing time and energy, and just like the parable, either the seed gets taken away or they fall away, and that can really take the wind out of us sometimes to invest so much. And I heard a lesson once, and it just said, we will never be hurt more than God is when someone falls away. Because compared to what God has invested in them, our human part, and yes, it's a very real thing, but that to me is a really helpful thing, is to think, oh, there's someone who has a deeper hurt when someone falls away than we do, because God is that. And when I talk with parents, and like my brother and sister-in-law, they read to their son twice a day, did all kinds of stuff. And after they moved back, they have a son who's just never reconnected with the church. And I would say, well, from a human point of view, they did everything right, and the child has still chosen to do something different. But isn't that God? By giving us free will, then we still have that choice. And one of our closest friends in Australia, our kids were the same age, and he said, kids come with a unlimited liability and a no return clause. And when you have teenage boys who start driving, then you pray a little harder than you did before, just making those transitions. But this to me is, again, a helpful thing for us to see as we go through. Look at how we see different things in perspective, looking at the time, the things that happen and take place. George, you help run this one around. If you want to turn, and I'm close to the very, very back, the listing of the parables, so I'm sorry, I'm wrong. The listing of the miracles. And on those sheets that are really solid, it's the one with the triangle at the very, very back. There's actually a second edition of this, and this was one of those early ones. When we were in school in Memphis, one of our teachers had been in London for 10 years, and there was a copy of this in the library, but Philip Slate said, if you ever come across a used copy of Preaching the Gospel from the Gospels, he said, would you please buy me a copy? I'd just like to have one for my private library. And I'm in, I think, a Presbyterian bookstore in Sydney, and the used books were up on some stairs, and I looked, and there was a copy of Preaching the Gospel from the Gospels. And so I bought it with no note, just airmailed it back to Memphis to him. And again, he said something in class, and I just always remembered, and I came across this. But a part of the kernel, the thesis of this book, and I keep this in it just for a reminder, virtually every parable and every miracle, the discourses are a little bit longer, but virtually every parable and every miracle you could write on a 3x5 card. Okay, they're not going to do this literally, but just stick with me for a second. They're going to be able to write it on a 3x5 card. And so, like for example, when the apostles go out on one of those early preaching journeys, what are they going to preach about? Well, they've heard Jesus teach parables. They have seen miracles. And so his book is entitled Preaching the Gospel from the Gospels. And as soon as I looked at it, I thought, this should really resonate with people who are members of the Church of Christ. And one of the things that he proposed is that, and I've just done this for nearly 50 years since then, one of the things that he proposed is that, and no one account is sufficient for everything, but there is an enormous amount of, quote, the gospel that we can teach people just using the Gospels. So we're not going to get into this at all, but because none of the people I studied with had read the Bible, we would work our way through the Gospel of John. And we talked about this. If you don't know anything about creation and you don't know anything about Jesus, we don't have any business talking about baptism until they have a sense of faith and know who Jesus is. And so we would teach gospel, literally, from the Gospels. And so let's just look at this, and then we'll take a break and stretch for a second. I'm just going to show you what we're going to do in the main points, and then we'll come back and finish this off. The miracles of Jesus are skillfully woven into the accounts of each gospel writer. And again, that's where your zip codes will really help you a lot. And if you notice, and I'm on the sheet with the 35 miracles, then notice how your first three miracles, or first two rather, are all going to come from John. And John's going to give us some details at the very beginning, and then when we get to the upper room at the very end, that none of the rest of them have. And as we've said, only 7% of John is in the other three accounts. So he's going to come, and that's just amazing that you could tell the same story and have 93% different information that is in the other three accounts. And we're going to look at this as a sample. Let's notice how the gospel can be preached or taught from the miracle accounts. So let's just look at the three major points, and then we'll walk through this when we get back. I'm halfway down under the dotted line, number one. And my idea is precedent. When we look in the Old Testament, there were times that God performed miracles through his prophets in the Old Testament. Now, we had a geologist from Texas who lived in Sydney with us for a number of years. And most of the gas and oil that is being produced in the Southeast Asian area then Earl Stanford has said, we're going to drill right there. I mean, he was the guy. And we're just standing kind of on the side, waiting for a class to start or worship or something. And Earl just said, he said, have you ever noticed, on the whole, how few miracles there are actually in the whole of the Old Testament? And I'm just thinking, no, I've never really thought of that. And he said, I'm not trying to trick you or trap you, but he said, where's kind of the first group of miracles that we find in the Old Testament? We're not going to count creation, that's God, but we're talking about it's involving people. Let my people go. And then he said, and then you have a period of time, kind of like the end of the New Testament, where there's not a lot of miracles. And he said it's going to be in the ministry of Elijah and Elisha. Moses is going to give the law and have the miracles for that. And with King Ahab and then trying to preserve the identity of Israel, then God raises Elijah and Elisha. But he said the biggest majority of the Old Testament, there's not a miracle on every page. And I just thought, I'd never thought about that. But at very significant times when God is either going to reveal something about his person, burning bush, I am who I am, and the things that he's going to reveal, or if he's going to try to preserve with Elijah and Elisha, then he will allow them to do miracles. But here's what's significant, and we're into type and shadow for a second. All three of those guys perform miracles to skeptical audiences. And what are they going to say very quickly about Jesus? Oh, is he doing this by Beelzebub? And as we walk through and we had come to the year of opposition, he's still going to do miracles, but notice the parallels between the miracles done by Moses, the miracles done by Elijah, and the sense of opposition, whether it's Pharaoh or Ahab, Jezebel, or whatever else it is, and how similar is that going to be as we move down to the bottom year of the ministry of Jesus. Okay, about 5 lines from the bottom. The ministry of Jesus was a type of the shadow of the Old Testament prophetic ministries. And I like to use this expression, and it's true in all of them, but especially in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus wears the mantle of a prophet because he's going to stand up in Luke chapter 4, read, and we'll see this in a second, read from Isaiah chapter 61. You know, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He's anointed me to do all of these things. And then he uses the examples of Elijah and Elisha, and they're Gentiles, and they're going to try to throw him off the cliff. And so we do have miracles in the Old Testament, but Jesus is going to wear the mantle of the prophet throughout his ministry. Okay, turn the page. The final thing before we summarize some things tonight is the miracles are sometimes recorded in clusters to advance the writer's narrative. And so when we come to this, when you come to Mark, the end of chapter 4 and into 5, he gives us, can I use the word sample? He gives us 4 totally different samples that kind of summarize all the different types of miracles that are found throughout the rest of the Gospels. And then the same thing's going to happen in Matthew. Matthew's going to have 5 blocks of teaching. And every time when Jesus had finished, and that will finish that one, but between 1 and 2, then he is going to list 10 miracles. So, back to the cafeteria tray. As the writer goes through and selects certain things, sometimes the miracles are just sprinkled throughout the ministry. And then other times, the same way with Matthew 13, there's 7 parables by the sea. Then sometimes the writers will kind of do a cluster, and this is kind of both kind of a summary, and let's look at the different types, and you can kind of examine the miracles in a context of, oh, look at the 4 different types of miracles that Jesus did. And so we'll see both of those activities taking place as we come back, and we'll walk through this after a break. One of the things that I did not, and just yet to leave some things out, but the whole, and I'm thinking just the concept of miracles, and whether we're with the apostles or with the other people, when John says all things were made and either through him or by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. The miracles, while they would have been hard for people to comprehend at the time, were not something that was any sense of stress or strain to Jesus. If you have created the universe to do any one of the miracles isn't going to cause a power surge. And one of the things that I think about is that, and again, he's walking by the Sea of Galilee, teaching the parables and stuff, and then in Colossians 1, Paul says, in him all things hold together, all things consist, and he's keeping the universe running while he's teaching parables by the Sea of Galilee. And so from that perspective, the miracles are spectacular on their own, but they're not, for him, they're not anything out of the ordinary because he's the creator of the universe. And it just amazes me the lengths that I've heard some skeptics to go to explain the miracles away. I mean, try this one on. The feeding of the 5,000, Jesus knew there was going to be a lot of people, and so they had sent some food ahead of time into a cave. And so with a sleight of hand, he kept reaching back. And I'm thinking, okay, we got enough food in this cave to feed 5,000 people. We're going to take up 12. And see, the explanation for why it didn't happen is harder to believe than the explanation of what did happen. And that's just something, like I said, through the years, it's just amazing the lengths that people will go to.
It's comical, isn't it?
It is. Look at the Trinity. God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power. He went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. When we talk about creating faith in our children, and if you've been in any of those, we talk about heart for our 1 through 6, our head 7 through 12. And when we start doing the hands, one of the verses I talked to my kids as teenagers was, if we walk in the steps of Jesus, Jesus went about doing good. And what can we do in our time and our place to follow in the steps of Jesus and go about doing good? But before that, God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit, and there's the three of them working together in conjunction with these miracles. Now, number 2, and this will flow over into things we're going to look at later as well. Good news, and I like that. I mean, nothing wrong with the gospel, but I still just like good news, was proclaimed in the sermons and the discourses. Good news, and what term would you use for the parables? I use the word illustrated, in that we tell this earthly story with a heavenly meaning to give us kind of a picture to kind of work through what that means. But the good news is demonstrated by signs and miracles. A quote, a miracle is faith's favorite child. And they may have disagreed with some things that he said, but how do you argue with a 4-day-old dead man walking around? Oh, is this the man who was blind? We're going to drag his parents in. How do you argue with a man that everybody knows that was blind that now can see? And so this demonstration, it's the gospel in activity, is something that's really helpful. There's 4, and there's others, but I just want to do these 4 words. And so we're now in Sermon on Acts 2, Pentecost. Peter's going to say, men of Israel, hear these words, Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God. And he's going to use 3 terms. 1, mighty works. 2nd is wonders. And 3rd is signs. And so that's very interesting to me. And this is number 3 at the very top, that God is going to attest, he's going to affirm the ministry of Jesus. Mighty works, wonders, and signs God did through him in your midst. And you can see definitions for these 3 different things. And it's the same thing, but just kind of a different perspective. You know, the first one are the mighty works, the wonders. The third one, and I owe a lot of my thinking on this to Jim Woodruff. If you are headed to Dallas and you see a sign that says, 100 miles to Dallas, you don't stop the car and run out and hug the sign and say, we're here, we're here. The sign points you on to the reality of where you're going. And that's what he said about the signs. He said the signs are significant, but they're not an end within themselves. They point people beyond to faith in Jesus. And so again, different than just a miracle. Oh, it is a sign to point you in the direction of your faith and your conviction in who Jesus was. And then under 3:4, and two samples of this, the testimony I have is greater than that of John. And Jesus says, the works that the Father has given me to accomplish, the very work that I am doing, bear witness about me that the Father has sent me. The testimony I have is greater than that of John, for the works the Father has given me to accomplish, the very work I am doing, bear witness about me that the Father has sent me. So there's at least 4 different words used for miracles as such: mighty works, wonders, signs, and works. Now, I wanted to kind of introduce this first one to you because we'll do these fairly quick. But when you look at Moses, and these were samples, 10 plagues, and I didn't put this down, puts his hand in his garment, comes out leprosy, puts it back in, the rod turns to snakes, crossing the Red Sea, the water from the rock. And so throughout the prophetic ministry of Moses, then there are times where God allows him to perform miracles. This one's very significant to me. Exodus 12 and 12, okay? 12, the complete number, 12 tribes. This one's easy to remember. I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and I will execute judgments on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. And this is very significant. The 10 plagues were ultimately designed to execute judgment. And I think each one of them, from an Egyptian point of view, would point to either some kind of deity or something that they worshipped. And so through the signs and miracles, 10 plagues, we oftentimes call them, then God is going to execute judgment on the gods of Egypt. When you look at Elijah and Elisha, and again, there's a whole group of them, but everything from fire coming down from heaven, the dead are raised, the feeding of widows, the healing of lepers, and we mentioned this under 1:2, close to the bottom, both in terms of God revealing himself with the giving of the law, and then with God preserving the law under the ministries of Elijah and Elisha, then they're going to have a greater sense of miraculous power than, say, a prophet like Isaiah is going to have. And I'll always be indebted to Earl pointing that out because I'd never noticed that. And there are times where there's very concentrated periods of miracles, and then there's extended periods of times in the Old Testament where the miracles aren't there. So here's the term, and I didn't know the best way to say this, but I used the term type and shadow. The ministry of Jesus is kind of foreshadowed, and, the ministries of the prophets is going to be kind of like the shadow, and then the reality is going to be the ministry of Jesus. And when he asked, who do men say that I am? All these people are prophets. Even John the Baptist is considered a prophet. Elijah, Jeremiah. And when you look at the ones I did in underline, when Jesus is talking to the 2 men on the road to Emmaus, he kind of asked them, well, what's going on? And they said, oh, haven't you heard about Jesus of Nazareth? He was mighty in words and deeds. And then later in Acts chapter 7, Moses is described as being mighty in words and deeds. And there again is that kind of that type and that shadow. The ministry of Jesus is going to be very much consistent and in harmony with that. So as we turn the page, in Luke 4, Jesus is going to read from the prophet Isaiah, and then his examples where they're going to try to throw him off the cliff are of Elijah and Elisha. And notice the bold. He has anointed me, and he has sent me. So those are two very significant things that Jesus says from Isaiah. And then he's going to talk about to proclaim liberty to captives, recovery of sight to the blind, set at liberty those who are oppressed, and proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And then I just did this note. He then will mention examples, and this is when they literally try to kill him, because the idea that God would do this for Gentiles, they weren't prepared for that. And Elijah healed Naaman the Syrian. Elisha helped to feed and then raised a widow's son from Sidon, and I just put they're Gentiles. So here's something that Brad had raised earlier, and then we're back with John the Baptist again. Are you the one to come, or shall we seek another? And Jesus is involved in the healing ministry and doing these prophetic things. And he doesn't give a direct answer, and just notice what he says, or what Luke says. You go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news preached to them. Blessed is the one who's not offended by me. And so in a sense, Jesus never directly answers the question, are you the one to come, or shall we look for another? But we're going to leave you to read most of these. There's a whole series of passages, particularly in Isaiah, that will speak about the coming of the Messianic age, or the Messiah. And under 2:4, and we'd mentioned this earlier, but it's just so important I want to mention it again. The one miracle that is mentioned in the Old Testament, but none of the Old Testament prophets do this, is the giving of sight to the blind. Every other miracle that Jesus does, in some form or another, one of the prophets of the Old Testament did that. And so look at these three places, and there's more there, but this is just the summary, and you can see the verses. You can check those later if you want to. Isaiah 29, and that should be 18 and 19 rather than 18 and 18. The eyes of the blind will see, and there's a cluster of other things, but just notice, the eyes of the blind will see. And then he continues in Isaiah 35, and here's a wonderful chapter about the coming of the Messianic age and things. Then he says, the eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped, the lame will leap like a deer. And then down in Isaiah 42, my chosen one in whom my soul delights, I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring justice to the nation, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, and from the prison take those who sit in darkness. So under 2:5, it should be the giving of sight instead of Oz. The giving of sight to the blind is recorded as individual events and in summary statements. And I'll leave you to look at those, but Matthew will go through and give individual accounts, individual miracles, and then he'll just give a whole group of summaries. Oh, the blind and the deaf, or whatever it was, they came and Jesus healed them. And I just left those in bold, and you can just kind of notice those. Let me do this from John just a second, because this is the first time I'd actually noticed this. And Leon Morris from Melbourne was the one who said this. There are 7 signs in John, and as you go through, they become increasingly more complex, they become more difficult to do, and they become more difficult to deny. The 6th sign in chapter 9 is the giving of sight to the blind man. And at the tomb of Lazarus, the skeptics say, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? So they're still skeptical, they're still critical, and they're still putting him down, but they just make that statement. And see, this is in the apostles. Oh, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying. And as they become increasingly more complex and more difficult, they become harder and harder to deny. But the sign before the raising of Lazarus is that unique event prophesied by Isaiah 700 years earlier. And while all the other miracles a prophet does in some form or another, none of them do the actual giving of sight to the blind. And so I always think of that as that that's the one reserved for the Messiah. Okay? What's the very first thing you tell John? The blind see. Can I use the term the penny dropped? The light came on. And so here he is in prison, and what Jesus doesn't answer directly, but he says, you go to tell John, the blind see. And that's that signature miracle that's reserved for the Messiah. Now, you can look at these others. We'll do these very, very quickly. In 3:1, as you start, and there are more miracles in concentration in Mark than any other gospel. And I had one more left. Here it is right here. So I put another sheet out for you, just the list of them there. And what the writer did was just to start and list the miracles in Mark. And depending upon how you count them, some will count 18 or 19 miracles in Mark. So the biggest single concentration of miracles. And can I use the word Reader's Digest? And I'm not trying to be, but just in terms of brevity, by design and everything, Mark is the briefest. And then here's the interesting thing. When you have parallel passages, and especially conversations, Mark's conversations will be longer than Matthew's and Luke's because they're going to have these big blocks of teaching, and they summarize. So when Mark talks about some events, he'll give you more details, but per chapter, per page, per word, however you want to measure it, there is a heavier concentration of miracles in Mark than any of the others. And if I was doing this at the very bottom, miracles only found in John, between chapter 5, the sick man at the pool, and Lazarus, then I'd have the healing of the blind man, chapter 9. I'm not quite sure why it's not there, but that again just gives you kind of a picture of how much the first three have in common. And then you'll have 2 in Matthew and Luke, 3 only in Matthew. And then when you look at Luke, notice 13, 14, and 17 are on the road to the Perean ministry on the other side, that unique section that are there. So there's 5 unique there, and then the ones that are found in John. So I'm back to the middle of the back page on this one here. 3:2, Matthew gives us these 5 discourses, and each one of these will say, when Jesus had finished. So at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus had finished saying these things. When you do chapter 10, when Jesus had finished instructing the 12. When you come to chapter 13, when Jesus had finished these parables. And that's a formula, and he gives us 5 blocks of teaching. And my first question is, who gives us teaching in the Old Testament in 5 books? Moses. And as a bit of trivia, the book of Psalms is also divided into 5 books. And writing to a Jewish audience, then in the same way that the original lawgiver gave the law within 5 books, then Matthew's going to organize 5 blocks of teaching. But notice this, and this is 3:3. In between the second and the third block of teaching, then Matthew records 10 miracles. Okay? Can you see echoes of the 10 plagues? And so Matthew has such a Old Testament Jewish perspective, and I use the term again as a compliment. My son is one of these, this kind of accountant, computer nerd, When I get past fingers and toes, I'm in trouble. And our son was on the academic team, and they would give these 3 numbers that would be at least 3 long. this number multiplied, this number divided, and the square root. And he would look straight ahead, and then he'd push the buzzer and give the answer. And later I said, Matey, I said, what's going on? He said, Dad, there's a whiteboard in your head. And I can do all the functions in my head, and I can lift an algebra problem off the... I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't know anything about the whiteboard. Past fingers and toes. I have no idea. And so he just thinks in terms of, and that's Matthew. So we're going to have these 5 blocks of teaching. Moses gave the 5 books. And Moses gave 10 plagues to Pharaoh. And between, you see what I'm saying? So just all through the book, sometimes the miracles are dispersed, and then other times they're concentrated. I chose not to do this, but in John, from chapter 2 to chapter 11, we've got 7 signs. So they're more concentrated. So that's just a sample. So we'll close with these things on the bottom, and we'll finish up tonight. I love this expression. Miracles announce the coming of the kingdom. And we'll talk about this later again. When I hear a kingdom, and I literally just kind of do this, I think of the rule of God in men's hearts. Oh, the rule of God in men's hearts is like a man who went out and sowed seed in a field. Oh, the rule of God in men's hearts is like a man traveling through a field and he found a treasure. And so when I think of the kingdom, and yes, the kingdom is God's reign, God's rule, all this other stuff, but if God doesn't rule in our hearts, he doesn't reign in our lives. And when I hear this expression, and again, Mark and Luke are going to say the kingdom of God. And if Matthew gives a parallel, it will always be the kingdom of heaven. I wonder if the Jewish audience would be a little more disturbed, harder to understand the kingdom of God. So when you have identical things, Matthew will nearly always call it the kingdom of heaven. And when you get to think about how much you've read Matthew and heard that, it just, the kingdom of heaven is like. Well, Mark and Luke are going to say the same thing, say the kingdom of God. And this is limiting it, it's bigger than this, but I always think of, first of all, the rule of God in our hearts and in our lives. But look at this expression, by the finger of God. The magicians said to Pharaoh, after we try to do some of these early tricks and stuff, and they quickly decide, okay, we're over our heads, we can't do this. And the magicians tell Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. We're now in Luke 11. But if it is by the finger of God that I cast out demons, then the kingdom of God has come to you. And see how Jesus goes back to that idiom, that expression, of all things that the magicians acknowledged that the miracles that they were seeing were the work of God, and they use this expression. And I'm being a little bit sarcastic when I say this, but I wonder what would happen if he used his whole hand. If this was just the finger of God, but it just announced, this is not magic, this is not sorcery, this is something that comes from God. And then Jesus says the same thing. If my miracles are the work and the finger of God, the kingdom's here. And that's the physical, tangible evidence of that. We've mentioned this. Signs are performed to point people beyond the miraculous deed to faith in Jesus. And this is my favorite description. Jim Woodruff said, John is the account of the unbelievable in the light of the undeniable. And they can't believe that a 4-day-old dead man is going to be raised from the dead. But then they get together and they start making plans to kill Jesus and to kill Lazarus. And you think, why are they trying to kill Lazarus if Jesus hasn't raised him from the dead? The signs point us beyond. The miracles, I love this expression too, the binding of the strong man. And Jesus is going to use this expression about Satan. And he will say, when a strong man, fully armed, guards his own palace, his goods are safe. But when one stronger than he attacks him and overcomes him, he takes away his armor in which he trusted and divides his spoil. And so the miracles are sometimes described in terms of the binding of the strong man, Satan, and his influence. But look at number 4. Miracles are going to cause multitudes of people to come to Jesus. How many people are going to hear the gospel because of a miracle? And very, very early in Mark, and I use the term, it's wall-to-wall people. And Tim mentioned this.
Close to the cage where all the food is.
Yeah. But you just think, it's probably a thatch roof. But still, here's all these people, and then all of a sudden the roof starts disappearing. I'm not really good with heights. I would, if I'm already having trouble walking, I would really hope these 4 guys know what they're doing as they let me down, through the roof.
That roof was strong enough to hold 5 people.
There you go. But all the things that happened, and they can't get close to it. And the miracles were a big part of the draw of that. Number 5, and this is a whole lesson within itself, but notice this. Some of the greatest confessions in the ministry of Jesus are given by evil spirits. And I just gave this as a sample. What do you have to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are. You are the Holy One of God. You're not going to hear the chief priest saying this. And you're not even going to hear the apostles early on. And there's several of these sprinkled through that. And a part of the purpose of miracles, of all things, the evil spirits are going to confess the divine deity of the Son of God, which is such a contrast to the religious leaders of the day. So, number 6, miracles were also a witness to the ability of Jesus to forgive sins. Which is it more difficult to do, to say, take up your bed and walk, or to say that your sins are forgiven? But that you may know that the Son of Man has the power to forgive sins on earth. I say to you, you take up your bed and walk. And again, here is this, can I use the term visual aid? Here's this demonstration to the skeptical Jewish leaders. And of course, they're just going to be incensed that any human being would be talking about forgiving sins. But Jesus says, just so that you know I can do that, I'm going to do something none of you can do. You take up, and so the miracle then confirmed the witness of the ability of Jesus to forgive sins. And then I just closed with this. Most people will say roughly about 35. A C before something is always about. A ballpark of 35 individual miracles, but there's a whole group of others sprinkled in all 4 of the accounts. But to close tonight, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples. And that's why I like the word selective, so much that we don't have. But here's the other thing. The Gospels are written to produce faith. They're written by people of faith to produce faith. You don't want to have a 12-volume encyclopedia that people have to carry around in a tray to do all that. And so we're back to the cafeteria line. They're inspired. Each writer, knowing about the teaching, the miracles, the parables, the discourses, the life of Jesus, will have a tray, and they can only put so much on it. And they go along and they select items from the life of Jesus to make a point to the people that they're writing to. But John says, these are written that you may believe he's the Son of God, and believing you'll have life in his name. Well done. Probably we'll do a little bit more, just little things on the train. And probably next week we're going to talk more about the parables in terms of where they function and fit like we did the miracles. And then I anticipate us doing the last week for the last class period, because there's more details given there. And there's also some questions about stuff. And then, Lord willing, our last one will be looking at the resurrection appearances afterwards that we read about, that we have information about Jesus after the resurrection. God bless. Thanks for being here.